Yeah, there's some fire.
Hey there. As you just saw in the intro, I'm designing and building my own rocket motor. The more astute of you may have also guessed that I'm building a rocket to go with it, and yes, that is correct, but more on that later. Due to the fact that building an entire flight-worthy vehicle is a pretty huge undertaking, this video will only cover part of the rocket project, that being the development of the rocket motor. But hold on a second. How do rockets even work? That's right. Bet you didn't expect to be learning anything in this video. Well, buckle up, because here we go, straight into the theory. At a high level, rocket motors are actually very simple. They throw mass in a specific direction as fast as possible. That's literally it. So how does this produce thrust? Well, I'm glad you asked. Let's take a look at Newton's laws of motion for an explanation. You've probably heard of Newton's third law. Every action force has an equal and opposite reaction force. When a rocket motor is firing, it is ejecting a stream of exhaust gas. Because the motor is exerting a force on the gas in one direction, that being out, by Newton's third law, the gas must exert a force on the motor in the opposite direction. A good example of this is a guy on a skateboard with a heavy object. Throwing the object in one direction will push him in the other direction. A rocket motor works on the same principle, only with trillions of little particles instead of one large weight. Additionally, if our hypothetical skateboard man were to throw the mass at a higher speed, then a larger force would be generated and he would be propelled in the opposite direction at a proportionally higher speed. Just rolls right off the tongue. The same is true for rocket motors. We want to accelerate our exhaust gas to as high of a speed as possible in order to generate the maximum amount of thrust per mass unit. Great, so with a little bit of theory out of the way, we're ready to jump straight into some rocket design, right? Well, not quite. There is one other major factor that needs to be decided before any design work can really begin, and that is, what type of rocket engine am I going to build? What do I mean by that? Well, in the world of rockets, there are approximately 1 million different designs to choose from, but 99% of all rocket engines can either be classified as a liquid or a solid. This name just describes what type of fuel they use. Solids use solid fuel, and liquids use liquid fuel. I know, shocking. There are other, more exotic types such as hybrids, nuclear-based, and ion drives, but none of these really fit the bill of what I'm looking for. And besides, I'm pretty sure I'd get kicked out of my dorm if they found out that I was building a nuclear reactor in my closet. I could be wrong though. Anyway, let's get back to the topic at hand. Solid and liquid motors. We'll start with solid motors. These motors are known for being comparatively easy to design and build, storable for long periods, and are usually smaller than liquid engines. A few solid rocket motors you may be familiar with are firework motors, anti-tank rockets, and the Space Shuttle Solid Rocket Boosters, or SRBs. Liquid-propelled engines are significantly more complex, but also boast better efficiency and the ability to be throttled. Oh yeah, forgot to mention, you can't throttle solid rocket motors. Once you light them, they will burn, and burn, and burn, until they exhaust all their fuel. So, in light of all this, I opted to build a solid rocket motor. Simplicity matters more than almost any other factor on this list, and you can't beat a solid motor's straightforward design. Someday, I'd love to venture into the wacky world of liquid rockets, but that day will not be today. Remember when I said that this video will put me on a lot of watch lists? Yeah, well, if anything will, it's this section, right here. This is also the part of the video where I have to tell you, the viewer, that rocket fuels are inherently dangerous. Although the fuel I'm using is not particularly awful, it can still burn your house or garage to the ground, explode, or otherwise cause harm. Consider yourself warned. Now, let's play with some fire. One of my core engineering principles is simple is better. In keeping with this, I'm going to be using a mixture of potassium nitrate and sugar as my propellant. This is a classic propellant formula that has been a staple of hobby experimental rocketry for decades due to its reliability and simple synthesis. Potassium nitrate, or KNO3, will be the oxidizer, and sugar, or C12H22O11, will be the fuel. When this mixture combusts, it creates potassium carbonate, carbon dioxide, water, and nitrogen. The last three of these products will be in a gas form, and is what composes our exhaust product. Sugar propellant is relatively easy to make. The emphasis in that sentence is on relatively. Really, the only thing that one needs to do when making this propellant is melt the sugar around the potassium nitrate. Since sugar has a lower melting point than potassium nitrate, it will be the only thing that melts, and you can encapsulate the potassium nitrate in sugar, thereby creating a good fuel and oxidizer blend. This sounds great, but I learned very quickly that you have to be very careful when you're doing this. If you run the hot plate too hot, you'll likely burn the sugar, or worse, ignite the propellant on the pan. This essentially creates a rocket motor that's firing in your face. Best to avoid that. If you run the hot plate too cold, then nothing happens. The sugar won't melt and you'll just have a loose pile of unbound granules. Also not ideal because you can't do anything about that. You might as well just put sand in your rocket motor and see if that works for you. I've experimented with several different methods of melting the potassium nitrate and sugar mixture, but I've had the most success with mixing the propellants before heating and then simply melting the sugar on the hot plate. This only resulted in one accidental fuel ignition. Great! It'll be good enough for my purposes. I was brimming with excitement. It was finally time to test something. I had just finished making a basic motor, or what I thought would be a motor, spoiler. After some mixing of a batch of propellant in a very safe and non-flammable manner, I packed it into the pipe, bolted the pipe to the test stand, and slapped a zip tie on there for extra safety. Then I lit it up. It, well, left a lot to be desired. Also, the zip tie melted. I did this once more to make absolutely sure that the propellant formula was good, and also because, I can't lie, playing with fire is fun.
Yeah, there's some fire.
After that, I called it a day. So, what went wrong here? Well, let me ask you another question to answer that one. Can you notice a difference between my motor and, oh, I don't know, literally any other rocket engine ever made? Yeah, pretty big difference there. Nozzles are needed for making a rocket engine, well, not suck. In the footage from the first test, we can see that the exhaust velocity is pretty low, but the pressure is fairly high. What we want is the opposite, high velocity exhaust at a low pressure, as this will create the maximum thrust. This is exactly what a nozzle does, thankfully, exchanging pressure for velocity. It does this according to Bernoulli's principle, which states that an increase in velocity in a fluid can mean a gas or a liquid, will cause a decrease in pressure. This is a direct result of the conservation of energy. Accelerating a fluid to a higher velocity will take some energy, thereby lowering the pressure. Pretty intuitive when you think about it. It would seem that the ideal shape for a nozzle is a cone with a large opening at one end and a narrow opening at the other, as this will accelerate the exhaust gas and lower the pressure, just like what we wanted. And you're right, this would be optimal, if it weren't for one thing. Ideally, the exhaust is going at or above the speed of sound, which is Mach 1. When this is the case, Bernoulli's principle no longer holds true. In fact, above Mach 1, the opposite of Bernoulli's principle is true. Let's give an example to explain things. When a subsonic fluid goes from a narrow pipe section into a large pipe section, it will slow down. However, when a supersonic fluid goes through the exact same setup, it will speed up further. The supersonic regime is dominated by some very funny, counterintuitive interactions, but most of the weirdness comes from the fact that the particles in the fluid are moving faster than they can interact with each other. This means that in the case of supersonic flow in a diverging section of pipe, the fluid will almost act as though it's heading into a vacuum or an area of lower fluid density, causing it to accelerate. I know this is a pretty hand-wavy explanation, but it's about the best that I can offer without going over a lot of fluid mechanics. At the end of the day, having a supersonic flow means that the ideal shape for a nozzle is actually a converging, diverging design. The fluid can accelerate when in the converging subsonic section, and then further accelerate when diverging in the supersonic section. I'm not going to go into the exact calculations that I did in order to get my nozzle geometry. All you need to know for the sake of this project is that I used a lot of spreadsheets, graph paper, and eventually ended up with some dimensions that can be turned into a CAD model. Armed with unlimited knowledge, I whipped up a design in SolidWorks. Actually, I whipped up several designs and made them fight each other until there was only one left. This one. It has about everything you'd expect to find in a good rocket nozzle. Converging section? Check. Diverging section? Check. There are also a few other small details, such as a groove for an O-ring to keep the exhaust gas from escaping, and holes for set screws so the entire thing doesn't go flying off into the wild blue yonder. Every other part of the motor is relatively simple, just a chunk of metal compared to my beautiful nozzle. The casing will be created by a metal tube, and the bulkhead or cap will be a simple metal plug to top everything off. As for the materials, the nozzle itself is going to be steel, and the bulkhead and casing are going to be made out of aluminum to keep everything nice and light for flight. So, it turns out that my nozzle is pretty difficult to manufacture. I attempted to lathe it out at my FRC shop, but there were no lathe tools that were small enough to fit inside the engine bell to create the diverging section. So what I ended up with was a nozzle with the correct throat diameter and converging section, but a diverging section that was much smaller than it was designed to be. Even so, I decided I might as well test it out, as I had already put an entire afternoon into building it. After mixing up another batch of propellant, this time with no unintended combustion incidents, thank you very much, I packed it into the motor. I also packed the majority of the nozzle with propellant, and this will act as a fuse, allowing me to light the top of it and then clear a safe distance before the bulk of the propellant would ignite. Same as before, I lit a match, set the fuse on fire, and hunkered down around the corner of my garage.
Here we go!
At first, it seemed as though the nozzle wasn't very effective, but upon reviewing the footage, I now believe that this part of the video is just the fuse. The real bulk of the propellant ignites right now. I may be wrong, but I believe this section of the exhaust is actually supersonic due to its positioning and the different appearance from the rest of the plume. Unfortunately, I had no way of measuring the thrust produced in this test fire, and in all honesty, this test was mostly just about ensuring that the entire motor wouldn't explode upon firing. The next order of business is going to be getting a hold of a full motor assembly with the correct dimensions and firing it on a test stand capable of measuring the thrust over time. That's going to have to be an adventure for the next time, seeing as I haven't, done any of that stuff yet. Also, I want to get this video out before 2025, so I'll see you around.